Okay, welcome everyone. Warm greetings to each of you and welcome to another webinar from Missio Nexus. My name is Eldon Porter, filling in for Marv Newell, and I'll be moderating today's webinar. I serve as a consultant for global engagement within the evangelical missions community globally. My role within the Missio Nexus is to assist the leadership of traditional Western agencies that are navigating the complexities of their transition from the West to the Rest paradigm and into the new reality that is referred to by many as from anywhere to everywhere. We're excited about today's webinar topic, After the Trip, Getting the Most Out of Your Short-Term Mission Through Debriefing. We know that this presentation will be helpful to you as a mission church leader because of your passion for the Great Commission. And as I look at the numbers here, we've got a great group coming before us here. Today's subject matter expert is Dr. Gary Green. Dr. Green is a veterinarian turned missionary who worked in Costa Rica and Venezuela. After repatriation in 2001, he established the Worldwide Witness Program at Abilene Christian University, preparing over 720 students for international summer internships. Dr. Green serves as the Associate Director of the Halbert Institute for Missions and as an adjunct professor of Old Testament and campus ministries. Gary, we welcome you to take the microphone and share with us on the topic of After the Trip, Getting the Most Out of Your Short-Term Missions Through Debriefing.
Well, thank you, Eldon. I was feeling very comfortable until you used that word expert, and it all kind of went downhill from there. But I appreciate all that Paul and Eldon have done to set this up for us. I'm excited about today, excited about the chance just to visit and share what we've been finding out and what we've been seeing through research here at Abilene Christian University. Rather than go over anything that has already been said, basically there's just my qualifications where I'm coming from. And as Eldon said, when I returned to the USA in 2001, I was commissioned with establishing some sort of short-term mission front door for Abilene Christian University. What we discovered was that prior to that, students would basically just go find some faculty member that they thought was going overseas or do their own thing and set up their own trip. And there wasn't a lot of direction being given. There wasn't a lot of standards being set. Students were just doing their own thing. And so we basically established a program that is not about just a 1 or a 2 week trip. We settled on the 8-week internship, and the reason for that is simply that we began to poll our students, and we discovered that most of our incoming freshmen had already been overseas. Now, in 2001, that was running around 50%. Today, when we talk to our incoming freshmen, we find a vast majority that have been overseas, sometimes 2, sometimes 3 different times. And our students come in thinking missions is something I've already been there, done that, and I check it off and move on. Those who want to go back overseas are very often not thinking a 2-month internship. So we like placing our students overseas for longer periods of time, and we typically send them out in groups of 2s and 3s. That prevents us from transporting the gringo bubble around. We have them live with local people, but they're under the direction of the local missionaries. We sent out our first interns in the year 2002. Since then, if we add up all our numbers up until those are going out this next week, 734 participants have gone out. And so basically, it's from that experience that I'll be speaking. At this time, I really would like to know who you guys are. So I'm going to throw it back to Paul for just a second to kind of give us an idea of who is tuned in today.
Okay, Gary, actually you threw it back to me, all right? So the question, the first poll question, we have 3 questions here. We're going to take one at a time, and Gary's going to give some commentary in between. But the first one is, who is attending this webinar? Please select one. From a mission organization you're representing, a denominational-based sending agency, academic institution, church, or other. All right. If you can be filling that in for us, that would be really helpful. And I'm going to try to watch here as we see the total numbers coming up here. All right. Boy, we've got some good numbers already here. Okay, and I imagine, Paul, I do the close here. We've got over 95 already. All right, so here's the answers. Let's see here. So we have from mission organizations, there's 69%, denominational-based sending agencies, 7, academic institutions, 1, churches, 19, these are percentages, and other, 3%. So Gary, that's your audience.
Yeah, so that basically means my partner and my wife are signed on as academic institutions, and that's about it, right? So that's very helpful to know, kind of to know who is listening in and to kind of where to go with a few of our comments. Okay, one of the things I think typically happens to us, regardless of where we are in the sending process, is there are assumptions that we all hold on to regarding short-term missions. This is especially true if we are in mission organizations where we've had multiple groups go out and we start hearing multiple stories of people coming back. But sometimes along the way, some of our assumptions lead us down the wrong path. And so years ago, I had a situation in my life that involved a flaming chicken. And so it left me very, very formed for the rest of my life. Let me share that story with you. And I think it'll help you understand perhaps a few of my views on short-term missions. Dropping back to my animal science / veterinary medicine days, a very little known fact that for most people is that all birds only have one functional ovary. Instead of having 2 functional ovaries, there's only one. One stays in a rudimentary stage, and if something happens to the hen along the way prior to puberty, then that rudimentary ovary can develop into sometimes what's called an ovotestes, or actually a male organ. And basically, it's kind of nature's cruel joke that the bird actually changes sex. So, when I learned this as an undergraduate, I was intrigued. And a friend of mine and I joined together to approach ConAgra, a major agricultural company, to give us animals, chickens of different ages. We set up a small house in which we caged a control group and our experimental group. We performed surgery on the experimental group, very young females, in which we removed the functional ovary, and then we waited over a period of time, a couple of months, to see if the second ovary was to develop into a male organ and change the sex of the bird. Now, after our couple of months were over with, we came to the day in which we were supposed to post the birds. Post is just a nice veterinary term for kill the animals, open them up, and see what's on the inside. Being a country boy, I knew that plucking that many feathers was going to get messy. And so my friend and I decided, well, feathers are made out of protein, assumption 1. However, they don't burn too quickly. And so we decided to help them out. Assumption number 2, put a little gasoline on the bird. That'll help. Well, we began to notice the gasoline kind of ran off of the back of the bird, didn't stay on there too well. So assumption number 3, let's rub the gasoline into the under feathers and soak this bird thoroughly. Then we decided, let's take safety precautions. That's always a good thing to think of down the road. And so we moved our operation down to the lake behind his house, tied a rope onto the leg of this chicken, and then lit it. Suddenly we had this 3 to 4 foot ball of flame that was quite impressive. And we were staring into this heat and fire, trying to figure out what was really going on, having a hard time actually seeing the animal. Waited, I don't know, 30, 45 seconds trying to figure out what was going on, and we finally just decided, okay, toss it into the water. This isn't going to go out. Toss it in. It was at this time that we found that the nylon rope that we had tied onto the bird had thoroughly burned off, and in our panic, we decided to just kick the bird into the lake. This produced an oil slick about 6 feet wide that was now floating across the lake on fire. Assumption number whatever came into play here, in which it was, let's grab the little boat sitting on the shore and go retrieve our bird. This is when we discovered the water moccasins under the boat and decided that was not a good plan. We ran back to the shore to where our bird had entered. Assumption number whatever else, my dear friend says, Gary, you need to jump in the water and go retrieve this bird. I replied, I can't swim. His response was, I can't either. Now we were down on our hands and knees paddling the water, trying to reverse the current and bring the bird back. As soon as it got close to shore, we finally were in our rejoicing, started to smother the bird with water, and accidentally reversed the current. The bird went back out to sea. We had to start the process over with. When we finally got it back to shore the second time, we scooped up the bird, at which time we discovered that when something burns at about 400 degrees, it's pretty hot. We tossed it up onto the shore. It landed in the puddle of gasoline, caught on fire a second time, which resulted in subsequent panic and repeating the whole process of kicking the bird into the water, paddling to get it back. This is about a 15-minute process. We finally rolled our little flaming chicken up onto the shoreline, and my friend looked me in the eye and said, the only good thing about this afternoon is that we are alone, and no one knows the results of what just happened. At which time we turned around to see his wife and child standing on the hill staring at us with the most incredulous looks you can imagine anyone ever had. So poor assumptions can cause us to spend a lot of time, a lot of energy, a lot of effort, and we never get the desired results. I discovered that with chickens, but I think it very much applies to short-term missions. I think there's a lot of chickens out there floating around and on fire, and we're spending a lot of time and effort chasing and running around trying to do things, but not really getting done what we anticipate we're getting done. For that reason, I want to throw it back to Eldon to ask a question about some of our assumptions that we hold.
Okay, you know the procedure here, so select here. Which of these assumptions above have you heard? Okay, please select one. Assumptions about STM have you heard? Increases prayer and giving, increases local church participation, leads to long-term mission participation, at least two of the above, or all of the above. All right? All right, so 2% have heard that increases prayer and giving. 2% increases local church participation. 8 leads to long-term mission participation. 34% have heard at least two of the above, and 55% have heard all of the above. All right, Gary, explain to us now.
Well, that is about what I had anticipated. As a matter of fact, if we go to just about any short-term literature, we will find those assumptions being listed. And it's almost this field of dreams concept. If you send them, they will, and you can fill in the blank. In fact, in an article done by Juan and Hart, interviews conducted with short-term senders and long-term receivers generated a list of 32 different aspects that were believed to be complementary. Now, this was not based upon any kind of quantitative research that was being conducted. It was based upon interviews with people going and people receiving and what was believed to have happened. So you can look at the article and you can find a list of 32 different things that people anticipate are going to be happening whenever young men and women are on short-term mission. All of us that are involved in this have also received tons of stories and anecdotal evidence. And I would not be surprised at all if 100% of what we typically hear tends to be very, very positive. Oh, I'm so changed. My world is different. As you can see on the screen, I have different examples. The very last one, I woke up to new priorities. Said by a young lady that we sent for 2 months to Zimbabwe a couple of years back, had a marvelous experience. She came back and she said, I never anticipated to feel, to believe, to see, to be changed like I have been. I woke up to new priorities every day. Then she said, I want to go back, but I want to go to a different country just to make sure that this is where I feel I am being called. And so we sent her back to a different African country. She had an amazing internship her second time around, came back to the United States, was totally on fire for missions, and is now singing country music here in the United States. Somewhere between I woke up to new priorities and hitting life after getting off the airplane, those new priorities seem to have faded. But I am sure that every one of us has heard a million of these stories, and they all seem to be positive. In fact, if you look at qualitative studies that have been released, all of these qualitative studies point to positive change. The vast majority of all qualitative research tends to be self-reporting studies in nature. In other words, someone goes on a trip, there's no pre-test done to evaluate a baseline of where they are in their behaviors and their attitudes. And then when they come back from a trip, the question is typically asked, is your giving changed? Do you believe you'll be more involved in church? Do you have a softer spot in your heart for missionaries, a different worldview? It's simply a question is given after the trip. And I think what we get out of that is this halo effect that's talked about in psychology. Halo effect basically is if a person walks into my office and I have a positive feeling about that person, then I tend to evaluate them positively. I think when our students go on a trip and their friends are talking about how positive this trip is supposed to have been, and they hear it from other people, and they've heard others that have gone out, not even on short-term missions, but on vacations to other countries, they know they are supposed to have a positive experience. And when they come back, they know we are looking to hear positive words about what they experienced. And so the reports are almost always and almost exclusively positive when they are self-reporting and qualitative. And then, as the famous line in Cat in the Hat says, something went bump. And that bump was someone finally broke down and did a little bit of quantitative research. When that was conducted by Verbeek, referenced there below, what he found was that all quantitative studies that had a pre-test and a post-test, or triangulation of results, or a control group, when one of those three factors was involved, which, hailing back to my veterinary medicine days, no research would have made it into the Journal of Veterinary Medicine or the Journal of the American Medical Association without one of those three factors being involved. So when we take our research to that level and look at things quantitatively, no significant change occurs to those who are analyzed from short-term missions. Scott Moreau reported the same thing in his article. To date, no direct correlation can be drawn between the massive increase in short-term missions and long-term sending. In fact, some hypotheses out there believe that we are actually inoculating people against long-term missions, that repeated exposure of being able to go and come is having an adverse effect upon our students. Our students are beginning to believe mission can be conducted that way over the rest of their lives, and they don't need to go through any processes or changes or long-term commitments. And so our short-term missions perhaps is actually having a negative effect on long-term sending. We don't see a subsequent increase in long-term budgets or changes in local congregations or overall increase in giving to denominations based upon the results of short-term missions when they are adjusted for changes in the economy. Sometimes I liken it to the starfish example. Years ago, people tried to eliminate starfishes by cutting them in pieces and throwing them back into the ocean, and basically what it did was just multiplied the problem as the starfish was able to regenerate different body parts. Sometimes I think that what we're doing is actually multiplying our problems, perhaps more than leading to long-term missions. So, where are we going wrong? Where's the glitch? Is it in poor training? I don't really think so, because there's a lot of really good materials out there. Dr. Joyce Harden recently released a book and a CD together you can find online. There's some great training tools, lots of other training materials. I've talked to churches, talked to other academies on what they're doing in the academic realm. There's a lot of good material available for short-term mission training. So is a problem during the experience? Are people actually having negative experiences and not reporting it? Well, if they are having negative experiences and we don't know about it, that is also another reason why we need to do a better job debriefing. I do know that some of our students have had negative experiences, but they didn't want to tell me about it because they didn't want me to change the program and perhaps eliminate that option for a friend of theirs that was coming down the line. They also had grown to love the missionaries that were with on the field, and they didn't want to cast a negative light on the missionaries. And so even though they had a negative experience, they didn't want to report it because they didn't want to cause problems for other people. However, based upon the extensive reports that we get from the qualitative research, I think that that's the exception to the rule. Basically, most people go overseas and have wonderful positive experiences. So that's what causes me to begin to think about after the fact. What is going on in reflection, interpretation, and application? If we look at what Dr. Verbeek had reported previously, creating a structure which holds all short-term mission participants accountable and encourages them will increase the likelihood that the short-term mission trip will not be just a mountaintop experience, but a catalyst which will result in dramatic increases in prayer giving and volunteering. The question is, how do you hold participants accountable? How do you work with someone after the trip to move them into a place where they are moldable and where discipleship and change can be reinforced. When I began to look online a few years back, and when I began to go to the library and research and try to ask questions of what's available, what should I be doing, I continue to come up with two common findings. Those two common findings were this. The first was, you should debrief. I could find statements like that all over the place. Debriefing is a great idea. You should be involved in it. People should do it. But then there wasn't a whole lot of information on how to. Catherine Tuttle wrote an article. You see it below, referenced year 2000. Those who received good or excellent debriefing in the studies she conducted were better able to process their experiences and integrate their learning into their understanding of their relationship with God and act that out in their love and service towards others. Her research indicated that when she looked at multiple groups, those who had debriefing were able to hang on to the changes that they had experienced while they were on the mission field. Yet even the studies she conducted didn't have a list of or a direction of how to do this. It was done, it was a good thing, and the study moved on. So the number one thing that you'll find if you go online and begin to do a research study or try to find out what to do about debriefing is the answer, yes, we agree you should do it. Second thing you'll find is a list of questions. Here's three examples which are good. These are great questions. There's good information here. I would encourage you, if you've not looked at some of these, pull these down, look at them, begin to use them in what you're doing. Many of these questions are also very valuable when taking students with you somewhere. This summer I will be in Ecuador and in Peru with a group of students who are thinking about forming a long-term team. I love sitting in the hotel room at the end of the day, throwing out some of these questions, having students process in the moment what's going on and what are they experiencing. So this is the second most common thing you'll find. Number one, you should debrief. Number two, a list of questions. Not much after that. Now, I want to be fair to what I found and say also there are exceptions to the rules. David Johnstone, in the article published in 2006, Closing the Loop, Debriefing and the Short-Term College Mission Team, laid out a paradigm. It's kind of a skeleton to work on, to lay flesh on, in which he stated we need to be thinking about 4 steps. First off, dissonance that can be generated by questions, by experiences. Second, habituation, modeling in my life and the life of the other people around me, life of other missionaries, and ongoing community to help reinforce what is being seen. So I appreciate David's article on that. And also you can find online by Katesky a PDF book, Re-Entry After Short-Term Missionary Service, written in 2010. Katesky's book is about 50 pages in length. It also has some good examples from the New Testament, multiple different ideas from Scripture, followed by questions on different topics in multiple different chapters. It's a good resource. So basically, this is my story. This is where we came out. Gentleman and I that established this program together, a good brother, Wyman Walker, now living in Uruguay, and then later on my dear friend Larry Henderson, who is now my current partner, who is tuned in from South China and trying to stay awake. This is our story of what we began to do with interns. From 2002 to 2006, the very first years of our internship program, we were so focused on recruiting and getting people on board and then trying to figure out the best ways to train and to tweak that honestly debriefing was something that often was almost an after fact. Our very first year, I remember after students left, Wyman turned to me and said, what are we going to do when they come back? And we had to sit down for about a month before students came back to process how are we going to conduct this. What we did for about 4 years is what you have on your screen. We would conduct one debriefing gathering after students returned. This was a Sunday afternoon. We found a local church not very far from campus that had a very large center. We invited our students over and divided them into about 3 to 4 groups. And I had about 4 colleagues that would go with us. Those were wonderful times. They were fantastic debriefing opportunities for those who actually showed up, which is about 30%. Compliance is one of the major obstacles to debriefing. So as we looked at this, we thought there's got to be a better way. How do we get beyond the 30% mark and get more compliance? So 2007, we interjected another idea. We kept the same format. We did our best to bribe them with food, as all college students are susceptible. But we also threw in a mixture of personal meetings during the same afternoon. Either myself, our graduate students, or other colleagues would pull some of the students out of the group time, go off to individual rooms, and try to get onto a deeper level. What does this mean for you? Where do you see yourself going with this? But again, even with that level of change, more personnel injected, we wound up with still 30% compliance even on our best days. So before I go on to what we're doing now, I'd love to throw it back to Eldon and just ask, is this my experience, or are we all on the same page? What does compliance look like for you?
Okay, you should see the questions there on your screen. In your experience, what percentage of STM participants show up for debriefing if offered? Less than 25%, 25 to 50%, 50 to 75%, more than 75. So the answer is, in your experience, what percentage of STM participants showed up for debriefing? Less than 25%, 8% said that. 35% said 25 to 50%. 22% said 50 to 75%. And 35% said more than 75%. So there you have it, Gary.
And that's very encouraging. I'm excited to see those numbers. Those are higher than I had actually anticipated. I was afraid that we had even smaller numbers. So I am very encouraged to hear that. I think this has been a focus of more and more people over the last few years, and hopefully that's translated into more of our students getting more out of it. One of the things that I often see happen here on the college campus, where we're dealing exclusively with students in our program, they hit the ground and the text messages are firing off, the phone calls, the families are showing up. By the time we get back together just a week later, they are already distracted by all the other issues going on. When it is a church-based situation in which it's a youth group that will come together automatically, hopefully compliance goes up. When it's older adults that have made a longer-term commitment to continue to walk together, hopefully compliance goes up as well. Here's what we're doing today that has really helped us out. Our debriefing now is part of a course. Our provost approached us and asked us to find a way to give students college credit for the internships they were performing. We did that by formalizing the training into a college class, and we put debriefing as 20% of that college grade. So if you do not debrief with us, you can lose 2 letter grades. At the end of the spring semester, you get an incomplete passing on your transcript, and we change that when the fall comes around. If you don't show up for debriefing, that drops 2 letter grades. We had a sudden surge of compliance. It was pretty neat to see us go from 30% to 100%. Definite correlation occurred there. So as we made that transition, as we made that transition, we also added in some other components. And so basically, this is where we are now with our debriefing. First off, every student that comes back will fill out a questionnaire for us. We find this to be very helpful for knowing what actually went on the field. The questionnaire basically is a Likert scale and asks things such as, I did my part in putting in the effort around the house every day. Remember, most of our students live with local people. I gave it my best shot at language training. I obeyed the missionary. I dressed in ways that were appropriate. I took the initiative in building relationships. We are investigating students' participation level, and we also ask similar questions that the student answers regarding the missionary. The missionary followed the norms, the missionary followed protocol, the missionary gave me the debriefing I needed on the field, the missionary spent 5 hours per week with me in mentoring. That's one of the policies in our program. So we asked the student to tell us about their participation level and the missionary's participation level. We also send a questionnaire much smaller to the missionary because we believe they just kind of suffered through 2 months of taking care of a bunch of students. So we reduced down the size of the questionnaire, sent it to the missionary, and they respond back to us, giving us feedback on the student as well. So that gives us a baseline, gives us a starting point, and typically students are self-aware, and what they say about themselves and what the missionary says about them tends to be pretty close. We've discovered that. We added in a couple of years back the Cerny Smith assessment. If you're not familiar with it, the website's there on the page. If you want more information on it, you can also write me. One of my colleagues is a distributor and works with Cerny Smith, also setting up training for them. But the Cerny Smith assessment is an assessment that measures stress on 20 different points. If you're not familiar with it, it'll evaluate such things as your organizational support, family support, workload, cultural skills, optimism, resiliency. How well did the student do in these areas? Now that they're coming back, now that they're landing here in the States, they take this assessment and it evaluates and puts onto different scales how they're doing in these different areas and more. So we therefore sit down with our students and we use this as the beginning of a talking point. Like all assessments, it should be taken just at face value, you're in or out, it's done. But it is for us a place to start with dialogue. Students will often tell us, say it's fantastic, no issues, no problems. We'll go, help me understand this optimism scale. Why is it a little bit lower? Where did that come from? And perhaps there was a glitch, a bump in the road, perhaps there was a conflict, and then it surfaces to us, and we can work through it and put it into a better light because of the Cerny Smith assessment. So I highly recommend something like that you use. Once we have the questionnaire answered by the student, once they go online and take the Cerny Smith, then we schedule one-on-one appointments with all of our students. They come into our offices, my office or my partner, Larry Henderson. We will sit down one-on-one with all of our students. In a few cases, if the students are close, and we had two that went together, we will bring them in as a group, as twos or threes. But typically, this is a one-on-one conversation. And we go over the questionnaire, we go over the Cerny Smith, and we ask them what their highs, what their lows. A lot of those questions that you can find online and those other websites, we do that in a very direct face one-on-one conversation. And then we talk about the book, Now What? Spiritual Discernment for Cultural Encounters. This is a book that came from our desire to slow students down. Our students come back, they jump into school, it's at full speed, they're signing up for classes, they're hanging out with friends, and you know how the story goes. Suddenly they tend to be much less focused on continuing the dialogue about what happened yesterday because they're so focused on what they're going to do tomorrow. So we wanted a way to bring students back to a place that would slow them down and cause them to reflect very slowly and methodically. Secondly, we were looking for a resource that would give students a way to apply the different lessons that they had learned, not just in reflection, but also looking forward. We wrote this and used it for 2 different years as a manuscript. We got feedback from our students, feedback from colleagues, and eventually put it into the book form that's now available. Let me walk you through a little bit of what this does and how we use it. For more information on the different chapters, you go to my website and find ideas there. The first chapter is simply just an introduction. Here's how Gary Green got involved in missions. I've been there where you're sitting now, so boom, here's some more ideas. When we moved to chapter 2, this was a chapter we almost didn't include in the book. This is a section that basically raises the question of how students interpret God's will for their life. Having been on college campuses since the 1980s as a campus minister part-time and then campus minister down in Latin America, and then here, just last week I taught a course on campus ministry. We were on Texas Tech University campus, UT campus down in Austin. It's a wonderful opportunity to hear how students are thinking, and what I have found is the way that students tend to interpret God's will for their life is pretty much across the board the same. And I want our students to think about the way they're interpreting their world while they're on the short-term mission, or especially while they're coming off of the mission. A good friend of mine, Dr. Dan Bushell, says he likes to use this book, having students read chapter 1 and 2 prior to the trip, put it on hold, and then come back and start in from there. Here's why. I find that the average student on our college campus interprets the will of God basically by what we call the DOT model. This is a belief that God has a specific will for me personally. And the closer that I get to that will, the more I can hit that bullseye, the more fulfilling my life's going to be. But it produces terrible anxiety in all of our students because they fear that if they cannot hit the bullseye for what God wants in their life, then they're going to be off the mark by a little way. The next decision, therefore, is starting in the wrong position, and they're going to be farther and farther and farther away from the will of God. Therefore, what our students want is really not divine guidance. They want straight-up revelation. They want God to take all the responsibility for the next step, tell them what needs to be done, and move ahead from there. I think the reason that most of our students believe this is they grow up with most of them with a plaque or a painting or embroidery that's on the wall of Jeremiah 29:11. I find it everywhere I go. I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans to prosper you, not to harm you, plans for hope and a future. Now, our students interpret that to mean God has a specific plan for me. When I teach Old Testament in the fall of the year, and I have about 90 sophomores sitting in my class, I often point out to students that the people that first heard that promise were either dead or in slavery within 5 years. So I don't think that verse means what you think that verse means. I want to challenge our students into thinking, if I get up in the morning and I hear a song on the radio and then I see similar words to that song on a little girl's shirt at the dump, suddenly God is telling me I need to drop out of school and move to this place, ignore all training, not listen to advice, not listen to wisdom. Here is the trump card. God has told me directly, boom, this is what I have to do. That's where most of our students tend to function in decision making. If they're thinking that, then when we debrief them from a short-term mission trip, what they get out of that trip is quite different from what they would get out of it if they were open to community discernment, scriptural discernment, the Holy Spirit moving in other ways in their lives. So I want to challenge our students on what they're thinking and how they interpret God's will early on. We bump into a few students that hold to the second principle, what we call the ditch model. And this one, basically, God has a highway, I'm on it, there are ditches on both sides, there are moral failures. And as long as I keep it between the ditches, God really doesn't care what I do. I've got freedom. God's simply concerned with morality. And so it perceives God as distant and uncaring, which is definitely the downside. And I find that some students act this way when they want to and then shift back to the other. There's a vacillation that goes on between the dot and the ditch theory, most of the time hanging on to the dot theory. We try to bump our students a little towards this model, the dad model. Okay? The father guides us and walks alongside of us. That's a picture of me and 3 of my kids. You can tell we're from Louisiana by the Drew Brees jersey, I guess. And we believe that the father walks along beside us on the path of life. He's not going to tell me where to step. He's not going to tell me the next step as much as he is going to be concerned about how I use the gifts and the abilities that he has planted in me. He wants me to develop those. And he's going to be happy and proud of me as his child if I find ways to use those gifts that are honorable and ways that bless him and the kingdom. This does not remove responsibility from the student, nor does it throw everything into God's hands. I'm just going to give you a sign. It puts more responsibility back on us, but keeps God very involved in the day in, day out decisions. So the second chapter of the book pushes our students to evaluate their paradigm for interpreting what God wants for their life. And I find that most of our students never, ever raise that question until they get to this point in life. And sometimes that's a very faith-shaping and kind of a tough place for them to be in. But it's a wonderful place for us to be alongside them as they evaluate. So that's what the second chapter does. After that, we move into chapters 3, 4, and 5 of the book, in which it asks the 3 different questions that we based our Worldwide Witness debriefing on. How did you see God? How did you see others? How did you see yourself? Every one of these chapters has about 4 to 6 pages of text, and at the very end of the text, there's going to be multiple reflection questions. Again, we wrote the book to slow people down. We hate it if they skip over the questions, because stopping and writing changes everything. It moves the ideas from one part of the brain to another and gives them something to go back to. So here's an example of what this looks like. Chapter 3, for example, starting kind of in the middle, just pulling some paragraphs. Clear examples of this can be seen on the Mall in Washington, D.C., a memorial to our first president, to the president who saved the Union. The thousands who fell during World War II to preserve our freedom sit at the very heart of our Capitol. Very appropriately, the Freedom Wall at the World War II Memorial has an inscription that reads, "Here we mark the price of freedom." These memorials mark significant events that we never want to forget. This is part of the chapter in which we're explaining to students why we want them to stop and write things down. It continues on. An example of my own life occurred while on the mission field. My wife encouraged me several times to keep a journal. Being much younger and less wise than I am now, I would always reply, "There's no way I'll forget this." As is often the case, she was right, and I was wrong. And then later at the end of the chapter, recently, you have experienced life in new ways. Some moments have been encouraging while others were less so. Some might have been Ebenezer moments where God stepped into your life in amazing ways. Others might have been Ebenezer moments in the life of someone close to you. If your spiritual eyes were open, odds are that God moved in some significant way or ways during this time of vulnerability in your life. So now is the time to raise your own Ebenezer in order to prevent that moment from being lost to you. That's actually how the third chapter ends. And then it throws students into a reflection question like this. How did you see God during your recent experience? Don't worry about comparing your moments with those of others. This is about you and God. Did you see him in adversity and victory in the lives of others or in your own life? There might be numerous events or there might be only one. Take time now to write about these times. There's a gap after these reflection questions actually in the book. You wrote it to be more of a workbook. There's just a blank space so that students stop and can actually write. What we find is that very few students actually write in the book because experiences are vast, and so they will typically sit down at the computer and write this out in some kind of a Word document or blog and then move on to the next question. I love it if they do that. It means they're taking even more time. It means the ideas sink in deeper. A subsequent question, reflection 3, for example, what does this moment mean? What is its significance? How does it affect you, or how should it affect you? Again, a space for them to write down the significance. And then most chapters end with a reflection question like number 4, write out one short and clear sentence that explains what you've learned. If any of you guys have ever sat on a committee trying to write a mission statement, you know how taxing this can be. But once you get that one line down, you can hang on to that memory forever. You can hang on to a lot of ideas all packed into one sentence. So we push our students in chapter 3, 4, and 5, where they're thinking about how I saw God, how I saw others, how I saw myself differently. We push them to boil this down into one clear statement. When they get through that portion, we want them to look forward. And so chapter 6 is called Janus and Ignatius. Janus, the Roman god of the doorway, transition, looks forward, looks backwards, and Ignatius of Loyola. So we use this concept of, now you've looked backwards, let's turn and look forward. This is a transition point in the book that goes from being descriptive to being prescriptive. I haven't found a lot out there that does that, so we just kind of want to push this for a little bit and see what we can get students to think about. And so we are pushing them from this point forward to raise the question, what does all this mean moving forward in my life? So chapter 6 is pretty long. It's about, compared to the rest of the chapters that are 5 to 6 pages, this one's 20. And we start out with that Ignatian concept of what deep desires were stirred within you as you were on this trip. What happened? Where were you touched in ways that you never saw? Where did you feel totally alive? And we get them to identify that and try to bring those concepts then of how they saw God and others and self and connect it with what was going on the inside. Perhaps that's leading them into a different direction with life, career, future plans. After they identify that, and again, there's a space, these are kind of sub-chapters, there's spacing in there for them to write about it. We move them into a time of prayer. We think this is very, very instrumental. You see, when Jesus began his ministry, he began it with a prayer of submission. Your kingdom come, your will be done. And as he was closing his mission, he bookended it with, not my will, but yours be done. So Jesus bookends all of his ministry with 2 prayers about submission. It is so easy for our students to come back, or anyone coming from a short-term mission, think they've figured it out and just take off. We want to help people slow down, come to grips with what's going on the inside, and then couch that in a submissive prayer, laying it out before God. And so we have a section there to help them do that. We move them into a section to think back about scriptural principles. What do you know about the Father? Is it consistent with what you're thinking right now? Are there specific examples of people having done what you are wanting to do or have done that's consistent with Scripture? The last little section here is about community. Jesus had Peter, James, and John that went with him into the garden when times were tough, and we raised the question of, who are your close friends that would go to the garden with you in tough times? Who are those guys? Identify them. Write their names down as blank. And then we say, now, don't read any farther. Go out and find those guys and share with them the experience you just had, what you're thinking, how it's affected your life, and get feedback, get wisdom in on this. Let a community come together around you and help shape what you are understanding about the significance of what you just experienced. Then we end the chapter with a session just called Decide and Commit. This is the pull the trigger moment. This is write out a pledge to action. What are you going to do with what you just decided about? What's your next action step? We think this is critical because if students don't ever commit to doing something, they tend to hang out there, and then within 3 days they're busy doing something else, and a lot of this can be lost. In fact, if you look at the dissertation of Frazian from 2004 that he wrote at the University of South Africa, his study, which was quantitative research, did reveal that people tend to digress after a short-term mission trip so that there is no substantial long-term effects unless there's ongoing discipleship and ongoing mentoring or a subsequent mission trip. So to have people write out an action step and say, this is what I'm doing next, and I've got some people that are garden friends that are going to hold me accountable, is consistent with the research about producing long-term change. We almost ended the book there, but we thought there would be 2 other steps that would be important. The next chapter may or may not apply to people as how to move from short-term missions to long-term missions, different options that are available because students often don't know about what's available to them. And then the last chapter is simply a chapter based on feedback. It's one that says, now that you've committed, now that you move forward, as you go along, be open to other people, be open to newfound truths along the way. Perhaps the Father has set you off on a journey in a direction, but you don't have a clear picture, and that will be clarified as you move along. So we're trying to get students to move forward, but in a wise way that listens to ongoing feedback. Basically then, that's our debriefing process. We have students fill out a Likert scale questionnaire about their activity. We evaluate their emotional stress status when they come back. We sit down face to face with them to dialogue about those 2 and go over this book that I just walked you through to understand where they are. Now, this past year, we started a 5th step. We started what we call spiritual discernment groups. And this was just open to any of our interns that went out from the past 2 years. We formed 5 different groups. 5 different colleagues took these groups and met 1 hour a week all throughout the week. We call this the reveal process because they're revealing initially who I am to the other people in the group. Sometimes these students don't know each other well. Being in a university setting, we had to do this based upon schedules very often. So who's free at 8 o'clock Tuesday morning versus who's free at 3 o'clock Tuesday afternoon. So our groups often were students that had similar interests, had known each other from the class, but perhaps went to different countries and different points. So they spend most of the fall semester really getting to know each other and sharing on a deep basis. We do this through genograms, we do this through storytelling, we do this by many different techniques. We expose them to options of what other people are doing. We asked about 15 different missionaries to record for 5 minutes how I got to where I am, what I'm doing now, and how you can be involved. We share those with our students and we let them just kind of think through all the different possibilities before them. And then we have 2 different discernment processes we go through. I'd have to say that our students were the most excited about the Quaker discernment process. If you've never used that in helping people move forward in decision making, I'd encourage you to look into it. What's called clearness committees within the Quaker movement. Basically, one person presents a question. There's a moderator that would be, those of you listening to this, that would be a moderator that does not allow for people to speak directly to the participant with advice. They can only ask open-ended questions, and this forces the student to really dig deep into what's going on behind the scenes in their heart. Why are they doing what they're doing? Every student that went through this process debriefed with us at the end of the semester, and that was the #1 thing that they pointed to that was the most helpful to them. Again, that is also consistent with a dissertation by Frazian that indicates that an ongoing group that gathers together over the course of a year tends to prevent digression back to previous behaviors and tends to retain the new behaviors that were learned when they were on the short-term mission together. In our case, here are the numbers. From 2002 to 2012, even though we didn't have as high of compliance as we wanted, when we ran the numbers of all of those students and where they are today, 18% of our short-term mission students, those who went for 2 months at least overseas, went on to serve for 1 year or became part of our 5-year church plant teams that we trained. So we had an 18% movement from short-term missions into longer-term missions. I don't know how you feel about 18%. If all of my financial investments hit 18%, I'd be a happy camper. The other thing that we ran down just recently was when we looked at our long-term team starting in 2009, that's when we kind of crystallized the formation process for long-term mission teams that we work with. These are teams that have 5-year commitments. From the first of those in 2009 to the present, 2014, we found that 67% of all of those on our 5-year teams were former interns. However, that number skewed a little bit. If we take the missionary kids that were not interns and all the foreign nationals, in this case, people that were Thai in return to Thailand, South Africa to South Africa, Australia to Australia, if we take out those foreign nationals and we rerun the numbers, what we find is almost 80% of our long-term teams came from our short-term mission program. So that's basically where we stand with our Worldwide Witness program. That's what we're trying to do with the debriefing process. Again, Eldon scared me to death when he led off with that word expert. This is just one guy and a group of partners that are doing our best to just work our way through and find how do we get people to reflect and then move forward. So hopefully there have been some questions sent in for some dialogue. And Eldon, I'll throw it back to you to kind of see where we are and if there's something that we can kind of clarify or give a little more feedback on as we wrap up today.
Okay, thank you very much. And let me just remind everyone that you can enter some questions there. There was quite a few questions entered for a while, and then it seemed to drop off. So let me just repeat here a couple of the questions that we have. What are your thoughts about The Next Mile, or www.thenextmile.org? It has debriefing questions, an individual mentor program to help with individual debriefing and follow-through accountability, and an encouragement to pursue Christ-likeness based on one's own journey rather than on one-size-fits-all. What is your response to that? Are you aware of it?
I have not looked at nextmile.org. Thank you for sharing that. I really do appreciate that. What I would simply say is this, that everything that, for example, in Frazian's dissertation and the other works that I can find, when there's ongoing mentoring or discipleship or spiritual direction giving, those vary slightly between the three of them. When there's ongoing influence along the way that's spread out over a period of time, the probability of retaining the change that occurred in short-term missions that we all see in the qualitative results is very high. So I'd be very excited about seeing this. I have not looked at that particular one, and I apologize for that. So that'll be my assignment when I finish up here today.
Okay, we've had several people comment about why they have such a high compliance on debriefs, and that is because they do it on the field. Like at the end of the time of being on the field, or one individual asked whether you know any statistics about the if the debrief is done every night during the time, a continual process while they're in the field area. So that's two things, Gary. One is several people acknowledge that their statistics are high because they've got their short-termers on the field and they have no option. You know, they're not running away. The second is, do you have any statistics or knowledge about the value of those debriefs that are happening while the missionary is on the field? And then I have a follow-up question that relates to this.
Great point. When we began our program several years back, what we did working and selecting the missionaries that we send people to was we told them we wanted two major things. One, we wanted internships that had students connecting relationally. We didn't want students in some back room just doing a project and then never see another person. So put our students into some kind of situation that's relational and give us 5 hours of mentoring per week. We told them they could break that down however they wanted to. What I have found when I look at statistics is everything basically breaks debriefing into that which comes after the trip is over with, the stats that I have seen. And Verbeek's study, basically he was looking at 3 different studies that he believed had pre, post, or triangulation results. And in those, the debriefing was done afterwards. So I think probably what we have here is a lack of clarity in how debriefing would be defined. I think that what I call mentoring on the 2-month overseas time period would be what people would be saying here in this question as debriefing while on the field, as opposed to something that occurs after the trip is actually over with. I am a huge believer in sitting down with students while they're in the situation and dialoguing about what's going on in the moment. When we compare, this is going to be qualitative and not quantitative, but when we have had discussions among our colleagues here as we look back over what internships get high ratings from students and those which get lower rating from students, internships that always have the highest ratings are always those in which the missionary sits down in a formal, routine way every week and dialogues with our students, asking questions of how does theory and practice come together? What are things you've seen that you don't understand? How does it affect your faith? And in those locations in which that occurs, our students come back and very frequently ask to either repeat that internship or go into another portion of our program, which is kind of a gap year program where they go overseas. So I think it is huge. I just think it is not included in most of the research because of definition.
Okay. Now, as you can imagine, there are quite a number of questions asking from the point of view of an agency, mission agency, and also some from a local church. And both of these camps are saying, okay, if you can drop people's letter grades, you can get compliance, you get people in there. But what about, do you have experience, do you have recommendations for agencies or for local churches that in their reality? Do you want to speak to that?
I think the best thing for a church, if these are groups that have come together as for example, as a youth group or as a college ministry or even an adult class, if that group has been coming together in preparation prior to going overseas, then I think people ought to sign up from word go with the understanding that once we come back, this group will continue to meet together for 1 month or 2 months or 3 months. If it's a youth group, that's already set in place. If it's a college group, that's already set in place. It's simply a matter of making sure that the briefing material is available when they come back. If it's another group that's formed independently, then I'll be looking for a commitment on the front end. For a while, we actually had our students, when we did not have a class, we had our students sign a letter of commitment. We explained in their bullet point 1, 2, 3, 4 of what was expected of them, and they would sign it and date it at the bottom so that they were signing on to actually being a part of some kind of ongoing debriefing. Hopefully that would work with the church. In the case of an agency, if these are people that do not know each other when they come together, I would say the same thing. Try to get a commitment signed on the bottom line. Every agency is so different. It's really, I really am a little bit lost of how to kind of go ahead and explain that one. I come from the Restoration Movement, which is Disciples of Christ, Churches of Christ, Christian churches, and in those cases we don't have a standing central agency, and so most work is done out of a singular congregation, and therefore I feel more comfortable answering the other part of the question.
Okay. Let's see, there's several other questions. I'm trying to group them here to cover. Would it be possible to get your PowerPoint? Several of them have you have asked about that, and there will be, I'll mention that at the end, and this will be available, the webinar, for your institutions. Here's one. Have you tracked participants in your 8-week program that have served outside of your long-term organization?
In a couple of cases, yes. We had students that are on our 5-year teams that have been are now part of our ongoing church planting teams overseas that served outside of our organization but did serve in internships abroad. So when I gave that number saying 80%, or actually it was 79% of our long-term teams have been involved in an internship, so the slide did not say a Worldwide Witness internship because it did include students who had actually been at a couple of other universities and had worked through a couple of other organizations to be on the field. In each one of those cases, it was a minimum of a 4-week commitment, and I think in most cases it was a 6-week commitment. So those cases, yes, we have seen positive results in.
Okay. What would you do differently with those that are returning from a 1 year volunteer service time? Do you have a recommendations for processing with them, the debriefing and carrying through with them?
Yes, and Eldon, I have to say, I am very excited that no one's asked any chicken questions. I'm feeling really, really encouraged about that. Um, yes, we have students that have been doing this. We've sent, I think in the last 10 years, about 20 students overseas. Actually, no, that's wrong. It's about 27 students that have gone over for 1 year. When those students come back, we try to do everything that we just went through for the short term and then add on to it. We try to have them into a mentoring relationship that's ongoing with one of my colleagues here. If that has been a scenario which has been specifically kind of difficult on the field, we had one young lady that just returned about a month ago from Nepal. She was actually living and working in a safe house in Nepal. That's a really tough environment to be in. And so we recommended that she work with us through the book. She's done that. We've gone through CSI, Cerny Smith, CSA. We've worked with her through that. We did the CSA midway through. We've also done it now at the end. We have her in an ongoing mentoring relationship with 2 older missionaries, and we are recommending that she go spend 1 week, a shout out here to MTI in Colorado, for their 1 week debriefing process. So that'll put her in touch with other people who have been long-term missionaries and not just 8-week missionaries going through a debriefing process. So if they've gone for a year, we recommend doing everything we just did, getting them into long-term mentoring relationships, and we have them go to a 1 week camp if possible.
Okay, very good. What about the size of the missions team that is going out there? Does that seem to affect the results? As you pull the teams together, do you prefer smaller teams or larger teams as far as the long-term results?
For our summer internships, we try to keep our teams down to 2 to 3 people unless they're going to an orphanage, because we find if they go to an orphanage, they are so diluted out so quickly as they're pulled in different directions by kids that we can send a few more. I don't think we've ever sent more than 6 people to any one location. So we tend to keep ours down. And the main difference that we find there is bonding with local people. If there's no North Americans around with which you can bond, then you have to bond with someone or just totally retreat. So by sending people in 2s and 3s, there's enough mutual support to keep them from caving, but also by having 2s and 3s, they can live in local homes, therefore they have to bond with local people. Our program is pretty much exclusively designed for that number, rather than sending out the big mass groups. I've taken big mass groups, I've taken large groups of students or adults overseas with me in the past, but those tend to be much shorter trips, and so because they are 1 week trips, we have done the on-field discussion at night about what you're seeing and feeling, but didn't go through a longer-term process when we came back.
Okay. Now we've had several questions, several people here asking about or making the observation that there needs to be some good research done for the agencies that are pulling people from across denominations, and it seems to be denominational-based groups. Several people have cited, and I'm not sure if this is someone from OMF, at least maybe one person would be from OMF, but they seem to have a very clear system, and several people have referred saying they're not with OMF, but they have learned a lot from the OMF model, so that's good. Mm-hmm. And let me see, I think we're pretty well here. Do you have any training process in place for your colleagues who are exercising and leading this debriefing process after the STM? As a missionary on the field, we do briefing during STM, but I would love to provide good group leaders with a manual or tool for them to continue the process wisely and practically as they lead their team home.
Well, that's one of the reasons we wrote the book. We've kept it down to 80 pages, so it's a workbook. We also have it available. If you go to the website, drgarygreen.org, we have it available. If you buy it in larger quantities, we can drop the price. It's $7.99, and so that's one thing we have out there. Kateski's book, which is online as a PDF, is available. This one is also available online if someone wants to download that. I would also be very willing for whoever wants to write, someone wants to write me an email and just say, hey, here's 5 people that I'm working with. They're going to be going through some kind of debriefing. Do you have any other resources? I'd be happy to continue dialogue on that topic and see if I can help anyone else out. But beyond those resources, that's kind of where I'm standing right now. I don't really have I don't have a seminar prepared or anything of that nature that we do for the debriefers at this time.
Okay.
That's a great thought. I love what's going on here as people are generating questions and sharing. I really appreciate that.
Yeah, I've got 2 more questions. First question is, obviously our teams are becoming much more multicultural from different areas of the world working together. Have you done any thought, any research on that, or do you know of anything that's being done as far as how to process this debriefing on a multicultural level?
Yeah. Frazien's dissertation, University of South Africa in 2004, actually had a few teams on it that were multicultural, and his research demonstrated that there was no difference in monocultural and multicultural teams in ongoing behavioral change and attitudes produced from short-term missions. Now, what we do find is that you have to be very careful in phraseology and wording, and that if we have a colleague that has been in that culture, we ask them to often do the debriefing with this local person. One of my colleagues in the room next to me spent years in Kenya. Next door down grew up in Thailand and worked there for many years. And so we try to defer to people that have a little bit better cultural understanding and therefore are able to move beyond grammatical glitches into a heart language. But I think once you get onto the heart language, then from what I'm seeing in Frazien's research, the debriefing process or the effects of debriefing tend to be the same.
Okay. And we end with this question. We're actually running a little over here. The question is, I'm really sorry if this is a stupid question, but was the chicken dead when it was lit on fire? And there's a question with some exclamation marks.
Absolutely, but it was especially dead afterwards.
All right. Well, thank you very much. And Gary, you've shared your contact information. Several people have asked if they can contact you, so that's available there on the screen. So thank you very much, Gary, for sharing with us today on this topic, after the trip, getting the most out of our short-term missions through debriefing. This is Eldon Porter, your host, along with Paul Erickson, our producer, saying thanks for listening on behalf of Missio Nexus, where we're advancing the effectiveness of Great Commission community in North America through our many services. Good day, and God bless you as you continue going forward with Him.